The most dangerous choices are never the ones made in a burst of madness. They are the ones made in silence, under pressure, with a trembling heart and a face that still knows how to look calm. In a city like this, where polished doors hide rotting loyalties and every kindness is eventually priced, ruin never arrives loudly at first. It begins with a favor, with an appeal to sympathy, with a wound someone shows only long enough to make another person feel guilty for still having a conscience. That was how Hayley stepped into it. Not because she woke one morning wanting to betray herself, not because she had stopped understanding right from wrong, but because she had begun to suspect that right and wrong meant very little in a place where survival belonged to those willing to bargain with their fear. By the time Randy made his shocking proposal, Hayley was already exhausted from trying to be decent in a world that rewarded calculation far more than grace. She had spent too long standing at the edge of other people's contempt, too long being measured, doubted, judged, and quietly diminished. What Randy offered did not come wrapped as evil. It came disguised as necessity. It came as a brutal correction to everything she had once wanted to believe about love, loyalty, and rescue. The proposal itself was so cold in its logic that it almost made Hayley recoil before it made sense. Randy did not speak to the better part of her. He spoke to the frightened part, the corner of her mind that had grown sharper with every new threat circling her marriage, every whisper, every sideways glance that reminded her how unstable her place beside Bill really was. He made her understand that the old way was over, that appealing to mercy would not protect her, that being harmless would not make other people spare her. He promised that if she helped create the right distraction, if she helped manage Lynette rather than resist her, if she accepted that appearances could be manipulated and danger could be staged, then the chaos surrounding her could be turned into something useful. Bill, he implied, could be kept close. His protective instincts could be activated instead of his suspicion. His attention could be steered. His guilt could be deepened. The marriage, already strained by pressure Hayley could feel but never fully name, could be preserved through crisis, if not through truth. It was a monstrous idea precisely because it carried a perverse kind of hope. Randy gave her something more seductive than love. He gave her strategy. That was why Hayley did not reject him immediately. The real tragedy of her choice was not greed, not even malice, but the slow corrosion of her certainty. She had begun to fear that Bill's love, however real it seemed in its warmer moments, was still tethered to conditions she could not control. She feared what would happen if he ever saw the full mess around her, the compromises already made, the people she had already tried to appease, the strings already tied to her wrists. She feared not only abandonment but replacement, humiliation, the cold finality of being set aside once she no longer fit the role she had fought to keep. In that fear, the difference between protecting love and preserving position began to blur. Hayley told herself she was trying to save what mattered. But beneath that justification lived a harsher truth. She was no longer sure whether Bill was the man she could not bear to lose or the life she could not bear to surrender. Once that confusion entered her heart, every moral line became easier to move. Lynette sensed that weakness almost immediately, because women like Lynette survived by reading fracture points in other people. She never needed to force Hayley in obvious ways. She only needed to keep tightening the emotional vice. Lynette made herself appear wounded when it served her, dangerous when necessary, humiliated when she needed sympathy, and ruthless when sympathy failed. She did not approach Hayley as a villain announcing war. She approached as a woman who understood the ugliness of being cornered and knew exactly how to weaponize the shared humiliation. She allowed Hayley to believe there was still some softness in the arrangement, some trace of helping rather than scheming. First it was the legal fees, the quiet intervention with Bill, the small favor that looked survivable because it could still be framed as compassion. Hayley let herself believe that was all it was. One step, one act of assistance, one debt settled. But in cities built on leverage, a single favor is never a single favor. It is an opening. It is a test. It is the first proof that a person can be moved. Once Bill was drawn into helping Lynette, even indirectly, the architecture of danger changed. Hayley had not simply helped another woman in need. She had invited an unstable force closer to the center of her marriage. What looked like mercy was actually access. From that moment on, Lynette was no longer outside the walls. She was inside the emotional geography of Bill's life, inside the perimeter Hayley most desperately wanted to protect. The realization came too late and in fragments. Hayley began to understand that every attempt to manage the situation was only deepening her involvement, but by then backing away seemed even riskier. If she withdrew, Lynette could turn hostile. If she confessed, Bill might see not sacrifice but deceit. If she continued, she could at least pretend she was still controlling the damage. That is how compromise hardens into pattern. A person stops choosing what is right and starts choosing what appears least catastrophic. The fake robbery emerged from that poisoned logic. Whether the original spark belonged to Lynette or whether Hayley's silence became the true point of consent no longer mattered after a certain point. What mattered was that Hayley saw the purpose in it and did not run. A staged threat would unsettle Bill, bind him emotionally closer, pull his protective instincts to the surface, and reframe Hayley not as someone hiding secrets, but as someone under siege. It would also create noise, the kind of emotional confusion that makes hard questions arrive later, softer, blurred by concern. For one terrible moment, Hayley even convinced herself that she was not inventing danger so much as redirecting it. If the city was already predatory, if forces were already closing in, then perhaps staging one crisis could prevent a worse one. That was the lie she needed most. That manipulation could still somehow count as defense. But the human soul rarely accepts corruption without leaving bruises. Hayley did not move through the plan with cold efficiency. She carried disgust with her, and that disgust became part of the tension that made her increasingly volatile. She hated Randy for how easily he spoke the language of damage. She hated Lynette for making desperation look like power. More than anything, she hated the version of herself that was beginning to understand both of them. Each concession left her angrier, not calmer, because every step deeper into the scheme required her to kill another piece of the woman she once believed she was. She had not grown cruel in the simple way people imagine. She had grown exhausted, defensive, brittle. She had started to see innocence as a luxury for people who were never truly threatened. That belief did not make her stronger. It made her easier to justify. Randy remained the most dangerous figure in the triangle because he understood that Hayley's shame was more useful than her trust. He did not need her to love him, and he did not even need her to fully believe him. He only needed her to accept that he knew too much. He positioned himself as both accomplice and shield, occasionally suggesting that he was protecting her from Lynette, while subtly ensuring she could never step outside the arrangement without risking exposure. He played the role of organizer when convenient, confident when useful, and silent threat when necessary. Every time Hayley tried to gauge whether he was helping her or hurting her, the answer seemed to change. That uncertainty was deliberate. If she could not define him, she could not defend against him. If she could not tell whether he was saving her or destroying her, she would remain suspended independence. Randy did not need chains. Ambiguity was enough. Lynette, meanwhile, became more brazen precisely because she could feel Hayley slipping. She no longer behaved like someone asking for mercy. She behaved like someone collecting what she believed she was owed. Her hunger was not purely financial or strategic. It was emotional too, charged with resentment, with the bitter thrill of watching another woman become compromised in the name of preserving something precious. Lynette needed Hayley's help, but she also seemed to enjoy what that help revealed. Every reluctant concession from Hayley confirmed a worldview Lynette already held. No one is truly good when the stakes are high enough. That was what made her so corrosive. She was not merely pulling Hayley into a plot. She was trying to erase the distinction between them. If Hayley became just as transactional, just as deceitful, just as willing to manipulate pain for survival, then Lynette no longer had to stand alone inside her own moral ruin. She could call it realism. She could call it the truth about people. Caught between them, Hayley began to realize the most humiliating possibility of all. She was not the mastermind of anything. She was not even a true partner. She was the most useful piece on the board because her emotional stakes were highest and therefore her panic was easiest to direct. She wanted Bill's love too much. She feared exposure too much. She still cared enough about appearing decent that guilt could be used against her, yet she had already crossed too many lines to retreat cleanly. That combination made her vulnerable from every angle. Lynette could pressure her with need. Randy could pressure her with knowledge. Bill, without even intending to, could pressure her with tenderness. The more closely he watched her after the staged threat, the more Hayley felt both relieved and terrified. She had wanted him near. She had wanted his concern, his focus, his renewed attachment. But closeness was no longer a comfort. It was surveillance. Every gentle question became unbearable. Every moment of attention became another chance for him to notice the cracks in her story, the timing errors, the nervous flinches, the exhaustion in her eyes that no frightened wife should have to fake because it was no longer fake at all. That was the cruel irony at the heart of the robbery scheme. It gave Hayley exactly what she thought she wanted and made it lethal. Bill stayed close, Bill watched, Bill cared. Bill started tracing patterns not because he distrusted her completely, but because he loved her enough to sense that something was wrong. Love, in the world Hayley had built around herself, became more dangerous than suspicion. A suspicious man might accuse, a loving man might keep digging because he wants to understand. The latter was worse. Bill's nearness denied her the relief of distance. His tenderness forced her into repeated acts of deception. His growing concern sharpened his instincts. The very strategy meant to bind him to her created the conditions for discovery. Every choice Hayley had made to avoid losing him now pushed her closer to losing him in the most devastating way possible, not through absence, but through recognition. As pressure mounted, Hayley's inner conflict grew uglier and more revealing. She wanted to tell herself she was still acting for love, but increasingly her decisions were driven by a frantic need to keep the structure standing no matter what rot supported it. She began lying not only to Bill, but to herself, and the self-deception was always a step behind the reality. When she felt remorse, she framed it as proof she had not become heartless. When she felt panic at the thought of Bill leaving, she called it devotion. When she resented the possibility of losing status, security, or legitimacy, she hid that resentment under the language of heartbreak. But beneath these noble disguises, something harsher kept surfacing. Hayley did not just want forgiveness in advance. She wanted to remain untouched by the consequences of choices she knew were darkening her. That impossible desire made her more reactive, more defensive, more willing to justify the next lie because the last one had already cost too much. By then, every relationship in the triangle had become infected with double motives. Hayley could no longer say with honesty that she was helping Lynette out of simple compassion. There had been a moment, perhaps, when pity had opened the door. But pity had long since fused with self-interest. She needed Lynette contained. She needed Lynette quiet. She needed the woman's volatility pointed away from her marriage. At the same time, she could no longer say she was only using Randy. Part of her had begun to rely on his terrible clarity, his willingness to say aloud what she herself could barely admit. That survival in this city often belonged to the person willing to stain their hands before someone else did it for them. And with Bill, love itself had become inseparable from fear. She wanted him, yes. She may even have loved him as sincerely as a compromised heart still can. But she also wanted the shelter his presence provided, the legitimacy it conferred, the emotional gravity of being chosen by him in a world that had too often made her feel secondary. To lose Bill would not only break her heart. It would collapse the story she had built about who she was and what her suffering had earned her. That is why the deepest betrayal in this story is not easy to assign. On the surface, it seems obvious to ask whether Hayley will betray Randy, betray Lynette, or betray Bill first once the truth begins closing in. But the answer has been there from the beginning. The first and most devastating betrayal was of herself. She crossed each line while telling herself it was temporary. She compromised each principle while insisting she still owned it. She became the kind of woman she once would have feared, not in one spectacular act, but through a series of frightened negotiations with circumstance. That is what makes her so tragic rather than simply villainous. She did not begin this descent because she loved corruption. She began it because she stopped believing goodness could protect her. Somewhere along the way, that belief turned into permission. And still, the story does not let her rest in victimhood. Fairmont glamour, legal favors, emotional entanglements, stage threats, and carefully rationed lies have all pushed Hayley toward the edge, but they have not erased her agency. She keeps choosing. Even now, as Bill's suspicion sharpens and Randy's grip tightens and Lynette's demands grow more dangerous, Hayley continues to decide which truth to bury and which fear to serve. That is what makes the situation combustible. A woman can survive being cornered for a long time. What she cannot survive forever is the war between the person she has become and the person she still insists she is. The more that war intensifies, the more likely it is that she will lash out not with clear intention, but with the desperate violence of someone trying to keep incompatible realities alive at once. So the real suspense is not merely whether the plot will be exposed. It is which version of Hayley will emerge when concealment becomes impossible. Will she finally turn on Lynette and Randy in a last attempt to salvage what remains of her marriage, sacrificing them before they can sacrifice her? Will she double down and feed Bill another lie, choosing survival over redemption one more time because she no longer knows how to return to the truth? Or will she discover, too late, that the thing she most feared was never Bill's anger or Bill's abandonment, but the moment he looks at her and sees not the woman asking to be saved, but the woman who helped build the trap around them both? In the end, that is what makes Randy's shocking offer so poisonous. It was never simply a criminal suggestion or a manipulative tactic. It was an invitation for Hayley to translate fear into strategy and call the result love. It was the offer to preserve her life by selling off the last uncorrupted piece of herself. She accepted because she felt cornered. She stayed because every retreat became more costly than the lie before it. And now, with Bill drawing closer, with Lynette hungrier than ever, with Randy still holding the map to her undoing, Hayley stands in the center of a storm she helped create. No longer able to tell whether she is the hunted woman in the city's cruel machinery or one of the hands helping it turn. The closer the truth gets, the less room she has to pretend. And when that final choice comes, it will not just decide who betrays whom. It will decide whether there is anything left inside Hayley worth saving at all.